Hi, I'm Maite Urcaregui. I'm a fifth-year doctoral student in the Department of English, and part of my research looks at comics and graphic novels. So I'm really excited to think through Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen with you a little bit today. So I just want to talk about the production history of Watchmen for a bit, because I think that's important when we're discussing comics, but also for thinking about the contemporary HBO miniseries adaptation. So the first appearance of the Watchmen characters is in DC Spotlight #1 in 1985. So this was an issue that was sort of celebrating like 50 years of DC Comics and putting a spotlight on that. So we get a little teaser of the characters there. And then what we know is like this book, this graphic novel, Watchmen, is published in serial form, so in single issues, about 30 pages that you will get at your local comic shop. And it's published from 1986 to 1987. And I won't dig too deep into the comics history, but 1986 is a pretty significant year in comics history where we see comics authors and artists really engaging with how the comics form can convey a deeper political critique, think about questions of identity, of nation, of power. We get some of our, canonical works like Watchmen, like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and then Alan Moore also comes out with Batman: The Killing Joke, another infamous 1986 comic. So this is a significant moment, and Watchmen is certainly a canonical text within comic studies. So the graphic novel takes place in 1985 in a sort of alternative present moment, and this would have been the present moment at its time of publication. And so it's a world in which masked vigilante superheroes exist, but they're not really the superheroes we might be familiar with. They don't necessarily have superpowers aside from one, Dr. Manhattan, and they're not always necessarily good people. So Watchmen traces a sort of genealogy of these superhero forces from 1939 to the present moment. And that's part of the formal innovation of Watchmen, is the way that it interweaves multiple temporal scales, and thinks about, how these timelines sort of conflict and intersect in the form. And so the first iteration of the superhero team in 1939 is sort of a celebrity crime-fighting team, but I think what is most powerful is the way that Moore critiques the idealized vision of the superhero, a figure that is wrapped up, especially in the United States, in idealized notions of whiteness, of masculinity, and the way that that connects to citizenship and state power, to nation. And so in this original 1939 team of superheroes, we see a lot of interpersonal conflict, and we see how these superheroes have some pretty criminal behavior themselves, both in public and in private, and in the very way that they understand how justice is created. So that's an interesting, and I think still salient, political critique. And Moore takes up the genre, the weight of the superhero genre within comics to make that. Then in the sort of contemporary moment, I won't dig into how we get there, but in the 1985 moment, we're in a alternative present in which the US has used Dr. Manhattan, the only superhero with powers, who through a nuclear accident is a sort of godlike, omnipotent figure who can travel through time and space, who can change matter, who can see into past, present, future simultaneously, and they turn him into a weapon of war. and they use him to win their war in Vietnam. And this essentially leads to a political climate in which President Nixon has been able to hold on to power, and which superheroes have been outlawed, have been forced into retirement, aside from those who are sponsored by and controlled by the state. So one of the central questions of the comic is, who watches the Watchmen? And this shifts across, the temporalities, who's watching these vigilantes as they, fulfill their visions of justice, and then takes on a different valence in the 1985 moment, thinking about state surveillance and a sort of supreme nation state. So I want to segue here to thinking about the show. And the show is also taking place, the HBO miniseries that came out in 2019. It's directed by Damon Lindelof, who also did Lost and The Leftovers. So like its comic book inspiration, the miniseries also takes place in an alternative present. It's kind of after the events of the comic, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a sequel, nor is it really an adaptation. It's sort of taking the story world, the world building, the characters of Watchmen, and creating an alternative 2019 moment. And so in this moment, we still have vigilante superheroes working alongside state and national powers, working with police forces. But the television show takes up race as a sort of central critique. And so the show has a cold open with the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, in which white Americans murdered and massacred what was known as Black Wall Street. And so that's the cold open. And then the rest of the show is sort of untangling the history since then, and how in the contemporary moment, mass vigilantes partner with the police to tackle white supremacist forces. So I think in terms of racial critique, the show is making a commentary that's very much absent from Moore's book, but at the same time, it is positioning police forces as a sort of progressive resistance to white supremacy, which I think elides the structural nature of white supremacy in the US and the way that the police force has been a force of white supremacy. I do just want to give another sort of content warning in case you do go off and read Watchmen. I think it is worth reading, but the graphic novel does address sexual violence. There is an attempted rape in the book, and that's something that the All Men creative team, Gibbons and Moore, really fail to address in a meaningful way, in a way that makes space for accountability. So that's certainly something that we'll be discussing in our UCSB Comics and Graphic Novels reading group next week. So this brings me to why I think Watchmen is a good pandemic read. One is, if you're looking for community, if you want to discuss Watchmen in community, the UCSB Comics and Graphic Novels reading group, a group that's open to undergrads, graduate students, faculty, will be discussing both the book and the TV miniseries next week, Thursday, September 17th. I'll make sure to put the details in the Nectar. You can reach out to me via DM or email if you have any questions. So, it can be a place for community, but also if you are looking to, binge watch something, you can read the graphic novel alongside the miniseries. And then in our present moment, I think it's an interesting pandemic read because it does ask us to think about, in times of national crisis, where and how do we seek justice? And how might the ways that we enact justice reinforce some of the power dynamics in our present moment? So I think that is something that Watchmen is concerned with, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you all next week in our comics and graphic novels reading group. Thanks for listening.